Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Between the Notes. I'm purposely not sitting in front of a piano keyboard or my piano because today we're doing a very special Between the Notes. This one draws on things like what you see behind me, nature, for its inspiration. I've often written music that has been inspired by what I see in nature, be that in the mountains here in Utah or in the desert or wherever I am. I tend to resonate with nature. So for the longest time, I was thinking of a project that dealt with mountains. I had a whole television series I was going to do that was about music and climbing called Sacred Places, Mountains. And I thought about it so long, and it never really materialized the way I thought. But I decided to write a symphonic piece. But I wanted to do something with lyrics, and even though I do write lyrics, I wanted this to be something extra special. So I decided to commission a woman whose name is known worldwide for her nature writing. Her name is Tempest Williams, and at the time I commissioned her, we weren't friends. I mean, we knew of each other, but I think we might have met once at a function, but never really knew each other. And so I commissioned her to write some sort of poetic libretto that I could use to compose this piece. I envisioned doing it for the Utah Symphony and the choir. So, and that is not actually the focus of what we're going to talk about today. So someday I will talk to you about how that all transpired. But suffice it to say, she did a marvelous job and came up with a piece that she named Timpanogos, a prayer for mountain grace. Timpanogos, can't see it from here, but it's a mountain in Utah where I grew up. I grew up at the shadow of Timpanogos. And so to choose that mountain was really special. So that was one piece, and the kind of libretto she wrote had these short couplets or like small little haiku lyrics that lent themselves really well to a choir singing. I'll never forget one phrase she wrote that I love. It was "Our highest thoughts, rock written," and that's something that one could sing very easily. So I wrote a piece of music using her libretto. When I say libretto, that's in music terms. That's the words used for a piece of music. But it was a poem or a prose or whatever she wants to call it. It wasn't rhyming. It was perfect. So someday, like I said, we'll talk about that. But the other piece the song wasn't long enough for one whole album. That was in the day before Spotify when we had to fill up a whole album. And so I had enough of a piece to fill about half of an album. So my manager and I decided, let's get another poet, Utah poet, to write another piece dealing with nature in Utah. I never really intended this to be gender specific, but I found another woman who was recommended to me. I looked at her poetry and I knew immediately she would be perfect. Her name is Susan Elizabeth Howe. I think she grew up in central Utah, but definitely her poetry and her writing resonated with me. It dealt a lot with nature and things surrounding her here in Utah. So I commissioned her to write the second piece, and that's what we're going to talk about today. It's all found on this album. Very few people know that I did this. This is an album I did with Utah Symphony, and it contains Tempest's piece that I wrote the music for called Timpanogos, A Prayer for Mountain Grace. That's Timpanogos there. And the other piece that Susan did was called Utah, 5 Sacred Lessons. It really was an amazing piece. Just the title alone, Utah, 5 Sacred Lessons. Here was her thought. Her thought was that what can we humans, who usually do a pretty crappy job of getting along with nature, what can we learn from the land? And she just had a wonderful way of saying it. Now, the way that she wrote was much different than Tempest Williams. Susan wrote with more complete sentences, longer thoughts, in a way that it made it difficult for me to use it and sing it. Music doesn't always work with poetry because we have phrases that need to be a little shorter. And so it occurred to me as I was reading her work, I really didn't want to mess with it. I wanted to keep its integrity. So I said, what about doing it with narrator and orchestra? Now, I grew up, like many of you, probably with Peter and the Wolf, Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, which was a great way to learn about the orchestra. Later on, I heard a piece by Benjamin Britten called The Young People's Guide to the Orchestra, which also had a narrator and so it was narration orchestra. But it really was a piece called Lincoln Portrait by Aaron Copland that really touched me and made me realize that I could take Susan's poetry and I could use her poetry and the pentameter and the rise and fall of her melody. She didn't think she wrote a melody, but the words kind of have a flavor that goes up and down. At the end of a sentence, it stops and so forth. So I thought to myself, I'm going to use that as the melody for this piece. Then I would supply the harmonic content. I would choose a palette. That palette that I chose was, when I say palette, I'm talking about the orchestral colors and the harmonic colors of the piece. I decided to do more of a watercolor, So her medium, let's call her narration, the India ink, and I was using kind of a watercolor. I didn't want to suggest to anybody a definitive musical painting. I wanted it to kind of have a little more, leave a little bit more to your imagination. So her words, my harmony, my rhythms, and my orchestral palette, that's how I envisioned this piece. So it's written in 5 lessons with a prologue. So the prologue was great. It allowed me to establish a motif or a melody. La ba ba beep bum bum. You'll hear it here, played by the trumpet. And this also allowed me to kind of to introduce the audience the palette. So take a listen to this. Listen to the theme, because you'll hear it throughout the piece, and then also the way that I'm painting with the orchestra. This is just the prologue. The narrator is Barda Heiner.
If this land rose from its place and opened, filled with light, a woman would come from inside. Would you know her? Would you turn to...
So I think you get a sense just by listening to that section that the melody, as wonderfully sung or narrated by Barda, I wrapped my music around, and it really was a wonderful way to compose. I love the line at the end of the prologue that said, "This land, our mother and father, how will you learn the land?" It's a great challenge, it's a great question, and it leads into the next lesson. So the first lesson is a lesson in art. And really, when I listened to her libretto, I just had to respond almost like I was scoring a movie. And so this first one deals with the creation mostly of the art of Southwest Utah. So she's talking about salmon colors and oranges and yellow and light and eons of time and wind and so forth that were the artist's tools. I say the artist, nature's tools to create this. This first lesson, and I'll just play a snippet of it, is called A Lesson in Art.
A lesson in art. The sculptors prepared their materials, laid down sand and rubble, and ground up shells for 200 million years. In time, the blocks rose. They rose.
Amazing lyrics. She just did such a great job. The next lesson was called A Lesson in Humility. And she starts out wonderfully by having us look down at our feet as we're walking through the desert, and we're looking down at small things at our feet. But then she turns us up to the stars, and the libretto and the music both take us up as we look up and see the eternal immenseness of our place. It's called A Lesson in Humility, and I think that humility is often lacking in humankind. So I love this next lesson, A Lesson in Humility.
Take off your shoes. Walk into the desert at night. The spine of a cactus in your heel is not essential, but may be part of the price. You need sand and rock and roots to anchor your feet. Dig in with your toes. Now, look up at the whole arc of the sky. That cascade, those silent needles of light that prick your body from explosions so fiery, so immense that if they had...
So that was just a little snippet of the second lesson. Each of these lessons are probably 2.5 to 3.5 minutes long. So they're not really long pieces, but just enough to give you an idea of what I had in mind. The next lesson is called A Lesson in Perspective. Here in Utah, what better way to gain perspective than to look at how we compare to the mountains. I love climbing the mountains here. There's a mountain, several mountains that I climb, but I climb every year, Mount Timpanogos, and you really get a perspective as you go on top of the mountain and look down and see exactly how insignificant we are. I mean, we are significant, but sometimes we add a little bit too much significance to our human intelligence and creativity. But we get a perfect perspective when we stand on a mountain or look up at a mountain. Here is A Lesson in Perspective.
The mountains are great ships floating above us, setting their course by the stars. But to know the mountain, there are other ways. Listen to the hummingbird, whose nest is the size.
The next lesson is called A Lesson in Usefulness. I thought it was the most intriguing lesson that she presented because she took salt. If Utah is known for anything besides mountains and skiing, we're known for the Great Salt Lake. And what seems like to some people kind of a barren, some people might say kind of ugly, not attractive part of Utah. And if you've ever swum in the Great Salt Lake, it's not the most enjoyable experience. But she said she had a way of twisting it around and turning it to where it's a beautiful thing to just see what we can get from the Great Salt Lake. And of course, salt The Morton Salt Company, among others, established a big plant here, and we still do create salt from this lake that continues to give us something useful. Here is a lesson in usefulness.
Consider salt, the word, the savor, tang on your tongue. Now the mineral, its concentration, how deposits become the ghost trail of an ancient lake, a desolate salt plain. Consider the old lake's remnant, the famous island where Alfred Lambourne, first to live on the lake for love, saw breezes play across currents at dusk, form shifting bands of amber, azure, rose. The whole surface, he said, gleams like a silken rose. Desiccant.
So those were 4 lessons. A lesson in art, a lesson in humility, a lesson in perspective, a lesson in usefulness. And then the last lesson, she calls this movement the last lesson of home. And what I love about it is it's not talking about a house that we impose upon nature. It's how do we get along? How do we learn from, the way she puts it, how do we learn from our mother and father? How do we learn from the land? And of course, at the end of this, you'll hear how she kind of comes to that place. I invite you to listen to the whole thing. It's on Spotify. I think you can find it on YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your free music. You can find it. It's just called. The whole thing is called Utah 5 Sacred Lessons in the album Timpanogos, A Prayer for Mountain Grace. So, basically, she says, if you can learn these lessons, it will give you a place, a haven, if you are wise, she said. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little more poetic side of one of my compositions. If I were to say one is one of my favorite musical experiences, it probably was working with Terry Tempest Williams and Susan Elizabeth Howe on this collaboration. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in to Between the Notes.
To give you a place, a haven, if you are wise.